So, for those of you who have seen Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and are just so excited for the upcoming sequels, you might know that the films are planned to span the course of 2 decades. This film taking place in 1926, and the final one taking place in 1945. And also, you probably know that 1945 was quite a significant year in both the Muggle and Wizarding worlds. It was a significant year in the Wizarding world because of the legendary duel between Dumbledore and Grindelwald. And it was a significant year in the Muggle world because, well, World War II ended. And considering some of the things we learnt from Fantastic Beasts, I would put good money on the fact that this duel and World War II are going to play a very significant part in the sequels. And I will even go as far to say as that the two are linked. And that Dumbledore beating Grindelwald in 1945 also marked the end of World War II. Hello there, how are you doing? There will be spoilers for Fantastic Beasts in this video. So, why do I think this legendary duel and World War II will play a huge part in the upcoming sequels? Well, when it comes to a duel, I think it's pretty obvious it's going to play some significant part in the upcoming films. We know that Gellert Grindelwald and Albus Dumbledore are both going to feature in the upcoming films, and Gellert Grindelwald is presumably going to be the main villain. And considering that the films end in 1945, which is also the year of the legendary duel, I think it would be a pretty safe bet to say that the legendary duel will be a fitting end to the saga. And the reason why I think World War II will play an important part is because we know that the wizards were involved in the Muggle World Wars, because wizarding involvement in World War I is mentioned not just once, but twice during the course of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. The first reference to wizards' involvement in the First World War was of course through Newt Scamander and Jacob Kowalski's conversation. Newt Scamander said, "You fought in the war?" To which Jacob Kowalski replied by saying, "Of course I fought in the war. Everyone fought in the war. You didn't fight in the war?" To which Newt Scamander replied by saying, "I worked mostly with dragons, Ukrainian iron bellies, Eastern Front." And if you're looking for a cool Harry Potter Easter egg, a Ukrainian Iron Belly actually features in the Deathly Hallows as the dragon that's guarding Bellatrix's vault. This second reference to wizards' involvement in the First World War comes of course when the crowd of wizards in the Macusa are discussing the name Scamander, where it's revealed that Newt Scamander's brother, Theseus Scamander, was considered a war hero. And from what we know about Theseus Scamander is that he was an aura, you know, a dark wizard catcher like Mad-Eye Moody for example, which you should know requires top grades in your newts from Hogwarts, which stands for nastily exhausting wizarding tests. The more you know. Now personally, I was relatively surprised in finding out about the wizarding involvement in the Muggle World Wars. Because despite the fact the Minister for Magic has to keep the Muggle Prime Minister updated if there's something serious going on our end. For example, in the Order of the Phoenix, Cornelius Fudge alerts the British Prime Minister to the fact there's been a mass breakout in Azkaban. But other than that, there's very little wizarding and Muggle governmental interaction. And the Muggle Prime Minister was only alerted to these things because it was a matter of Muggle safety. And realistically, I would have thought the wizards would have wanted nothing to do with the Muggle Wars. But I have searched into the deep dark depths of Pottermore about the wizarding involvement in the First World War, and here's what I found. The Minister for Magic during the First World War was called Archer Evermond. He passed emergency legislation forbidding witches and wizards to get involved, lest they risk mass infractions of the International Statue of Secrecy. Thousands defied him, aiding muggles where they could. And one of the people who defied him was none other than Harry Potter's great-grandfather, Henry Potter. And I'm sure I'm right to assume that Harry was actually named after him. Henry caused a minor stir when he publicly condemned the Minister for Magic, Archer Evermond, who had forbidden the magical community to help muggles waging in the First World War. However, from what I said earlier, we know that the wizards were involved in the World War at some point. Because apparently there were dragons up on the Eastern Front, and some wizards were even considered war heroes for their actions in this war. Which must mean that the wizards were involved in the war at some point, but were then withdrawn from the war, because of the fear of the Statue of Secrecy being overturned. And this fear of the Statue of Secrecy being overturned is really important, so don't forget that, because I'm going to come back to that later in the video. I found even less on Pottermore about the wizarding involvement in the Second World War. We are told that Leonard Spencer Moon was the Minister for Magic, and he enjoyed a good working relationship with Winston Churchill, who of course was the British Prime Minister during World War II. This is an interesting detail for J.K. Rowling to include, because it implies that the wizards were involved and maybe even played a significant part in the Second World War. I also think that this lack of information on Pottermore about the wizarding involvement in the Second World War is evidence that World War II will play an important part in the Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them sequels, and J.K. Rowling just doesn't want to spoil anything. Hashtag keep the secrets. I find this involvement in the Second World War very interesting, because if the wizards were forbidden to take part in the First World War, why would they take part in the Second World War? Wouldn't they learn from their mistakes? And those of you ready to comment that the Second World War was way more brutal, and that there were loads more fatalities, and that the Second World War might have even been a danger to the wizarding community with all the bombings, I agree with you. I think that the Second World War was so brutal, it made the wizards almost feel endangered, making them feel they needed to take part. But what does this have to do with Grindelwald? Well, since it's known that the wizards were involved in the First World War at some point, we can place a guess that maybe Gellert Grindelwald was actually involved in the First World War. However, his involvement in the First World War isn't of the utmost importance. What is important is that Grindelwald is aware that wizards were withdrawn from this war because of the fear of the Statue of Secrecy being overturned. And we know that Gellert Grindelwald dreamed of the Statue of Secrecy being overturned and creating a new order where wise and powerful witches and wizards were the benevolent overlords of the world, including muggles, for the greater good. This is addressed multiple times in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, most prominently in Albus Dumbledore's letter to Gellert Grindelwald. Gellert, your point about wizard dominance being for the muggles' own good, this, I think, is the crucial point. Yes, we have been given power, and yes, that power gives us the right to rule, but it also gives us responsibilities over the ruled. We must stress this point. It will be the foundation stone upon which we build. Where we are opposed, as we surely will be, this must be the basis of all our counter-arguments. We seize control for the greater good. We've also got to take into consideration that from the years 1920 to 1945, there was something called the Global Wizarding War being fought in continental Europe. Which again, despite there being a lack of information on this topic, we do know that it was started by Gellert Grindelwald and his followers with the intentions of enslaving the Muggle population. And by the year 1939, which was of course the year World War II began, Grindelwald would have been fighting this global wizarding war for 19 years to no avail. And by this stage, I think he might have realised that he needed a new strategy. And the fact that the First World War almost overturned the Statue of Secrecy would have come to great interest to him. And I think that this was probably the thing that caused him to change his plans from attacking Muggles to turning Muggles against each other, in turn causing World War II. I don't know exactly how he did it, but there are going to be 4 more Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them films to reveal that, so I guess we'll have to wait and see. Maybe he used the Imperius curse on Muggle world leaders, who knows? J.K. Rowling has confirmed in interviews that she loves creating parallels between the Muggle world and the Wizarding world, and this would just be the icing on the cake if it's true. And also, I don't think it's a coincidence that the date of Grindelwald's duel with Dumbledore and the fall of Grindelwald coincides with the date of Hitler's death and the fall of Nazi Germany. Grindelwald also never gained power in Britain because he feared Dumbledore, and Britain was one of the few countries in Europe that wasn't Axis controlled. And finally, I wouldn't be surprised if MACUSA didn't get involved in this war until a bit later on, until eventually they do join, which leads to Grindelwald's inevitable downfall. And to think, I never thought I was going to need to use my knowledge on World War II I learnt for GCSE history ever again in my life, but here I am. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. If it blew your mind, leave a like down below. If you disagree with me, leave a comment down below telling me what you think. If you want to see another Fantastic Beasts theory, I have a theory here about how Newt Scamander gave Aragog to Hagrid. And if you want to keep informed about future videos, maybe subscribe by clicking here. And other than that, I will see you guys next time.